Good evening. My name is Darryl Robert Schoon, and in March of 2007, I delivered a paper before a private network. Membership was $5,000 a year. It was composed of what you would call out-of-the-box thinkers. One gentleman was in the Credit Hall of Fame, top bond trader, had a multi-billion-dollar bond fund. Another gentleman, Dr. Jim Hart, is probably one of the foremost researchers in the area of consciousness and biofeedback. And another person, Dr. Sherry Clark, had gotten her doctorate on synergestics, the work of Buckminster Fuller, and had dedicated her life to prison programs. And at her retirement, she had been given 3 prisons by the state of New York. And they said by their own calculations she had saved them over $1.5 billion in countless lives. It was a rather interesting group. And in March 2007, I delivered a paper before them. And I predicted that real estate would collapse in the United States, the stock market would collapse, and the United States and the world was indeed on the verge of another Great Depression. In the spring of 2007, this seemed highly improbable. The Dow was on its way towards making another all-time high. The real estate market may not have certainly fallen apart. It was showing a few signs of fatigue, but real estate prices were still intact. Within months of my delivering this paper, $2 billion hedge funds collapsed on Wall Street. That August, a worldwide credit contraction took place. People stood outside a bank in England trying to get their money out before it collapsed. And almost as if by magic, what I predicted began to happen. Now, what I said at that time was that the coming financial collapse was part of a greater change. It was only a part of a far deeper shift that was going to overtake humanity. A shift that involved not just economics, but politics, survival, present institutions, and the earth itself. What just happened in Japan is an example of what I saw that was going to happen. Just as I foresaw the economic collapse that happened months after I made my prediction before that group called the Positive Deviant Network, the earth changes are now in motion. Less than 3 weeks ago, we had a massive earthquake in Christchurch, New Zealand. Massive. Just months before that, in Australia, we had cyclones, flooding. The coal industry in northeast Queensland, Australia, was basically brought to a halt. And now, I think the largest earthquake, 5th largest earthquake in the last 100 years, has just taken and hit Japan. And what they tell us is this. Japan is on what they call the Ring of Fire. Tectonic plates that are moving against each other. And these plates have been at loggerheads since 1933. Not one was able to take ascendancy over the other. And a few days ago, a few hours ago, measured in that terms, it happened. 8.9 on the Richter scale, massive tsunamis, massive loss of life. And now they're looking at the possibility of 1 or more nuclear reactors melting down unless they find a way to bring them under control. Just as much as I expected the economic collapse to happen, what happened in Japan, what happened in New Zealand, doesn't surprise me in the least either. Because I always said that the economic collapse is part and parcel of a greater shift. And so it is. So it is. What we have lived through in the last 50 years is a period of illusory quiescence. It was illusory. Illusory is the wrong word. Temporary. Temporary is a much more definitive word of what we've been through. prior to these last 50, almost 60 years, since 1950, since post-World War II, the previous 60 years on the world were fraught with trauma. From the end of the 19th century to the mid-19th century, 20th century, we had two of the most devastating wars on the planet. We had never had a world war before. In that 60 years, we had two of them. We had never had a depression before. In the 1930s, the whole global economy shut down, and we had for the first time what we called a global depression. We had never had atomic bombs and explosions before. At the end of World War II, we had two. Our world struggled out of the shadow of the disasters of the early part of the 20th century and came into that era, which I believe most of us share. I'm 66 years old. Classic baby boomer, born in 1945, just as World War II was ending. I came of age in the United States in the 1950s, an era of suburbs, piano lessons, Little League. I went through the tumult of the 60s to emerge into a credit-binged world starting in the 1980s, after it staggered out of the dissonances of the 1970s, stagflation, oil shocks, monetary crises, and from then on, it was off to the races. Most of you who are listening to this program had it easy. You may not remember it as easy, but I will assure you it was far easier than the previous 60 years. Unless, of course, you were drafted and went to Vietnam. Then it wasn't easy. But that was only a small taste of what the generations in front of us had experienced. From 1950, 1945, until 2000, we had 50 years of relative quiescence. And what I'm saying today is that relative quiescence was temporary. Beginning in 2000, the wheels started coming off. The last 10 years have seen the emergence of the East and the collapse of the West, a process that has only just begun. What people are afraid of is that the West is going to collapse and the East is going to rise. Let me assure you, the way I see things, both are going to collapse. No one is going to emerge out of this the way we went in. The fear that China is going to send and we're going to be in the dust, we don't know what's going to happen. But what I want to say is that the changes that set in motion, the financial changes of the last few years, are still in motion and they're gathering steam. What happened in Christchurch? What happened off the coast of Tokyo is going to come to the United States. This is not a crisis that's going to happen to somebody else. This is a crisis that is going to happen to all of us in one form or another. Let me show you a map here. This is a United States Geological Survey map of these states, contiguous. There they are. St. Louis, Memphis are the cities. The states are Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Arkansas, and Alabama. That purple area is the area the United States Geological Survey points out as extremely vulnerable to a great earthquake. In 2010, the University of Chicago published an in-depth report on this area. This area is known, you can Google it if you want after this program. It's called the New Madrid Fault. That map was drawn up by the United States Geological Survey as its warning on the areas that are going to be affected. The University of Chicago put together an in-depth study of the possibility of what happens when this fault goes. This fault last time blew up erupted, slipped exactly 100 years ago in 1811. 7.4 earthquake, devastated the region. Of course, in 1811, there wasn't a whole lot of people there. Today, it's very different. This is what the report said from the University of Chicago. If a quake of that similar size hit now, at least 3,500 people will die and more than 80,000 will be hurt. 715,000 buildings will be damaged. 7 million people will be left homeless. 2.6 million households will be without power. And it'll have an impact of $300 billion on the economy. The two towns most at risk because of their proximity to the fault zone are St. Louis, Memphis, although towns in Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Arkansas, and Alabama will also see damage. An Associated Press article notes that there were 4 earthquakes in the 7.0 range in 1811 and 1812. 4 during those 2 years. This is now 100 years later, and they said the chances of another earthquake are building today on the new Madrid fault. As an example of the concern about this possible earthquake, what happened is FEMA put out an RFI, which means request for information, in late January and early February. They asked for enough food to feed 7 million people for 10 days. They asked for a quotation on blankets to help keep people warm. 7 million people for 10 days. They asked the Department of the Navy to produce a quote on underwater body bags of a sufficient amount. This is in response to the United States Geological Survey's response to the University of Chicago, Illinois report of last year. Let me tell you something. When Katrina hit, devastating New Orleans, they knew it could happen. They didn't know when, but they knew an impact of a hurricane on those wetlands, on those low-lying areas, could very well breach the levees of New Orleans, and it happened. And not only was this country caught off guard, they were caught looking like the fools they were. They don't want to this time. This is why they're preparing for the possibility of the new Madrid fault earthquake. Now, I have known about this fault for decades. I have expected earthquakes to happen, just like I expected the economic shock to happen. I expected governments will fall, and they are falling today. We are in a period of unprecedented crises that we have not entered into before. Now, when people live through a period of relative ease, they are the least able to deal with hardship and crises. If you go through a period of intense crises, you become battle-hardened, as it were. You become wary about the world in front of you because you know it can change on a dime. But if you live through a period of relative quiescence, which all of us have in the last 50 to 60 years, you are ill-prepared for the magnitude of changes that are now upon us. What I want to say about these changes was predicted. Now, those people in the government, they don't like these words to be repeated. They want you to feel safe, secure, optimistic. Enough so you'll go out and take a $500,000 mortgage out on your home. Pay the bank interest for 30 years. They want you to feel confident enough that you'll go and take out a loan so you can become a hospital tech in empty bedpans. And perhaps, if you're lucky, pay that loan back. If you're lucky. And if you don't, they're cool, because the government has guaranteed that loan and the banks are going to get it paid back anyway. What you are in is you are victims of a massive confidence game to keep the cycle of debt and credit going and going and going. And you've done this little by little over the past 50 to 60 years. In the 50s, not a lot of credit. In the 60s, a little more credit. And in the 70s, they pulled the cotter pin out of the ATM machine. And the 80s, Reagan's years, the bankers' years, Wall Street years, you went to the races, you bought a car, your parents bought a car that you couldn't afford, you bought a house, your salary went up, everything went up, and you thought because of your hard work, because of your perspicacity, because of your foresight, you were able to buy a goddamn strip mall and make enough money so you could buy a Cadillac that you wanted. And you sent your kids to school. My friends, those days are over. You could sit there, put your hands on top of your TV, and pray to God that they're coming back. I can assure you they're not. I want to read you something written by a futurist. It's not a word that is used very often. It was written by a man named Buckminster Fuller. Some of you may have heard of him. He has a reputation for, quote, inventing the buckyball, which is a carbon ring, all right, geodesic domes. People have these vague notions about Bucky Fuller. Some people, feel very, very warm about the memory of this man. Buckminster Fuller was a genius. He was a mystic, and he was a seer. Time magazine once featured an article on him, and they said that he had made 50 predictions. Back in the 20s and 30s, 48 of them had come true. Absolutely stunning record in terms of prediction. 1981, Bucky was a year away from his death, and he wrote a book called The Critical Path. And the book was intended, it was his legacy to us, who he called his fellow travelers on Spaceship Earth. Bucky saw us on this planet, humanity, going from somewhere to somewhere else, and he saw us on it together. And in 1981, this is what he wrote. It was advice to us, to humanity, telling us what was going to happen. The introduction to Buckminster Fuller's The Critical Path, Harvard professor, man of note, great heart, is titled Twilight of the World's Power Structures. He wrote this in 1981. Within 10 years, the Soviet Union fell. Communism in its form that had been there for a few decades was no more. And now, 30 years later, capitalism is following in communism's footsteps. Twilight of the world's power structures. This is what Bucky said. Humanity is moving ever deeper into crisis. A crisis without precedent. First, it is a crisis brought about by cosmic evolution, irrevocably intent upon completely transforming omnidisintegrated humanity from a complex of around the world, remotely deployed from one another, differently colored, differently credoed, differently cultured, differently communicating, and differently competing entities into a completely integrated, comprehensively interconsiderate, harmonious whole. Second, we are in an unprecedented crisis because cosmic evolution is also irrevocably intent upon making omni-integrated humanity omni-successful, able to live sustainingly at an unprecedentedly higher standard of living for all Earthians that has ever been experienced by any, able to live entirely within its cosmic energy income instead of spending its cosmic energy savings account, fossil fuels, or spending its cosmic capital plant and equipment, atomic energy. The atoms with which our spaceship Earth and its biosphere are structured and equipped. A spending folly no less illogical than burning your house and home to keep the family warm on an unprecedentedly cold midwinter night. Bucky wrote those words in 1981. My friend Marshall Thurber was a friend of Bucky's. Bucky was his mentor. And I had a conversation about this book with Marshall. And I said, Bucky used his words like tools. He didn't use them for emotional effect. He didn't use them to scare people or to get them to do things that they didn't want to do. He used tools, words with precision. And I told Marshall, I said, Bucky used the word unprecedented. This man was perhaps one of the most brilliant men on the earth at the time. Unprecedented? He knew about the Black Plague. He knew about nuclear holocaust. He knew about all the tragedies that happened on this earth. He knew about mass starvation. And Bucky used the word unprecedented. That's what I'm here to talk to you about. I'm here telling you that what happened in Japan, quote, happened in Japan. And because you weren't in that city when the tsunami came rolling up any more than you were on that beach in Thailand when the last tsunami took out tens of thousands of people in one move, doesn't mean change is not coming to your neighborhood. I'm not saying it's going to be like this. I'm not saying the tsunami is going to all of a sudden be on Main Street tomorrow where you live. I'm saying that you are now in a period of tremendous cosmic evolution where humanity is going to emerge far different than he is today. Bucky said the world is going to be so much better in the future than it has been in the past. It will be unrecognizable. But if you think this change is going to come without trauma, if you think this change is going to come out without you changing your life, your attitudes, your sense of spirituality, and your relationship to your fellow man, rest assured, you will be a part of that change, but not in the way you would like it to be. We are watching this without even understanding what we are in. We have been moving towards this for decades. Bucky wrote that in 1981. Other mystics, other seers have foreseen this happening for decades. But here in the cocoons of the West, greased by huge amounts of credit based upon paper coupons that we could give the Saudis for their oil, paper coupons that we could give the Japanese for their cars, paper coupons that we could give the Chinese for their toasters. Those days are ending. They've only been with us for a few decades, and everything comes to an end, good and bad alike. I want you, if you have the ability, if you have the openness, if you have the desire to understand the changes that are going to be sweeping this country, affecting your life and the lives of those you love, to wake up in a way you haven't woken up before. You can be swept away by a tsunami in your sleep just like that. And that happened to a lot of people. But what I want to tell you is, it's not the purpose of the universe to wipe us off. But the purpose of the universe is to keep on living, to keep on expanding, to keep on being. And if you look at humanity in this past 100 years, our intent has been absolutely against the intent of the universe. If we couldn't make money off of it, we didn't care. We've treated this planet like an infinite resource. It isn't. You're coming to the end of your plate. Your bank account is almost empty. Thank you.